It started with the late-night shifts. At first, I didn't think much of it. Marissa, my wife, was a neurologist. She had a demanding job, just like me. We both worked at the same hospital, and long hours were par for the course. But something felt off. It was the way she'd come home, too cheerful, almost forced, or the night she didn't come home at all, claiming she'd been too tired to drive and crashed in the on-call room. I told myself I was overthinking it. I'm a therapist, after all. I spend my days unraveling other people's baggage, helping them sort through their insecurities and paranoia. Was I projecting? Nah, I thought we were that couple. You know, the ones people point to at work and say, relationship goals. Stable careers, nice house, shared inside jokes at staff meetings. But then there were the little things. The perfume. Marissa's taste and scents had always been subtle, light, and clean. Suddenly, she was wearing something heavier, musky, and frankly sexy as hell. Not her style. I noticed she'd started carrying cash, which was odd because Marissa didn't believe in cash. She once argued for 20 minutes with a diner waitress about accepting Apple Pay, because who carries paper money in 2024? She also started working out. At first, I thought it was great, fitness is important. But Marissa had always been indifferent to the gym, dismissing it as a place where sweaty people pretend they're better than you. Now she was going religiously, even on her supposed days off. And don't get me started on the new lingerie I found tucked away in the back of her drawer, tag still attached. Am I losing my mind? I muttered to myself one night as I lay in bed, waiting for her to come home. It was after midnight, and she hadn't answered her phone. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe she had an emergency with a patient. Maybe she was caught up in a surgery or consoling a family. Maybe she was out having drinks with a friend and forgot to text. Or maybe, and this thought crept in no matter how much I tried to shove it back, she was with someone else. The next morning, she was her usual charming self, breezing into the kitchen as if she hadn't just ghosted me the night before. "Morning, handsome," she chirped, planting a kiss on my cheek. I didn't bring it up. Not yet. Instead, I smiled and asked her if she wanted coffee. I'd always admired Marissa's confidence. She could light up a room with her smile, command attention with just a glance. Patients adored her. Colleagues respected her. But lately, her charm felt like a mask a little too polished. She wasn't just confident. She was untouchable, like nothing could rattle her. I started paying more attention, watching, listening. The more I observed, the more I noticed how she twisted conversations to her advantage. If I asked a pointed question, she'd sidestep it with a joke or turn it back on me. "Why are you asking about my shift so much, Noah? Feeling a little insecure? Maybe you should talk to someone about that." "Oh, wait, you're a therapist?" She'd laugh, and I'd force a smile, feeling like I'd just been slapped with a velvet glove. Things came to a head 2 weeks later when I checked our joint credit card statement. Marissa had spent $300 at a high-end boutique downtown, a place she'd once mocked as overpriced nonsense for bored trophy wives. "What's this?" I asked, holding up the statement while she poured herself a glass of wine. "Oh, that," she said with a wave of her hand. "I needed a new dress for the fundraiser next month. You know, the one for the new pediatric wing? Don't worry, it's for a good cause." I stared at her, trying to reconcile this explanation with the fact that I'd seen the dress she was talking about. A sleek black number that didn't exactly scream hospital fundraiser. "Right?" I said slowly. She drained her glass in one gulp and smiled. "Relax, Noah. You're so uptight lately. You need to loosen up." She walked out of the kitchen, leaving me standing there with the credit card bill in one hand and the sinking feeling that something was seriously wrong. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her so badly. But that gnawing doubt was getting harder to ignore. Maybe I should have confronted her right then. Maybe I should have told her how I was feeling, how the trust between us was starting to crack. But part of me wasn't ready to face the answers. Instead, I threw myself into work, hoping that the distraction of my patient's problems would drown out my own. But it didn't, because every time I looked at Marissa, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was slipping away from me, taking pieces of our life with her. The thing about Marissa was that she had mastered the art of the performance. She wasn't just charming. She was magnetic. At the hospital, everyone adored her. Nurses lit up when she walked onto the floor. Doctors scrambled to sit next to her in meetings, and patients sang her praises in reviews that made administration beam with pride. Dr. Marissa Carter is a gift to this hospital. One of the higher-ups had once said at a gala, his champagne flute raised in a toast. And I had believed it, too. I mean, how could I not? She had this way of making people feel seen, like they were the most important person in the room. It wasn't until later, when I really started digging, that I realized how much of it was smoke and mirrors. Marissa wasn't just a charmer. She was a manipulator. She'd smile at you, flatter you, make you feel like you were her best friend, and then she'd quietly pull strings in the background to get exactly what she wanted. I'd seen her do it with colleagues, casually nudging her way into prestigious committees or subtly undermining anyone who got in her way. And the scary part? No one ever saw it coming. She had a way of making her actions seem like coincidences. That coworker who lost a coveted position to her? Oh, it was just bad timing for them, wasn't it? That doctor who stopped being invited to board meetings? Well, maybe they just didn't have the right qualifications. Marissa would sit across from me at dinner, telling me these stories like they were harmless anecdotes, and I'd laugh along, completely oblivious. It wasn't until recently that I started replaying those conversations in my head, wondering how many of those coincidences had her fingerprints all over them. But the thing that really got me was how she treated me. See, Marissa knew exactly how to keep me hooked. She'd sprinkle in just enough affection to keep me from questioning her. One day, she'd show up at my office with coffee and my favorite sandwich, flashing that smile that made my heart skip a beat. The next, she'd brush me off with an excuse about being too tired or too busy. It was a cycle, push-pull, and like an idiot, I fell for it every time. One night, I came home to find her curled up on the couch with a glass of red wine and a movie playing on the TV. She looked up as I walked in, her face lighting up like I was the best part of her day. "Hey you," she said, patting the cushion next to her. "Come sit with me." I dropped my bag by the door and joined her, sinking into the couch. For a moment, it felt normal, comfortable. She leaned her head on my shoulder, and I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, things were okay. But then her phone buzzed. She jumped up so fast it startled me. "I'll be right back," she said, grabbing her phone and heading to the kitchen. I heard her whispering, her voice low and urgent. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. My gut twisted into knots. When she came back, she was all smiles again, as if nothing had happened. "Sorry about that," she said, sliding back onto the couch. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Yeah, just hospital stuff," she said, waving it off. "You know how it is?" I nodded, but my mind was racing. Who was she talking to? Why was she being so secretive? I didn't press her. Not yet. Instead, I started paying closer attention. It was like peeling back layers of an onion. The more I observed, the more I saw how calculated she was. Her late shifts started to seem less about work and more about something or someone else. She'd come home smelling like a mix of hospital antiseptic and something expensive. And then there were the bruises. They were faint, almost imperceptible, but I noticed them. A shadow on her wrist one week, a faint mark on her collarbone the next. When I asked about them, she laughed it off. "I'm clumsy," she said, rolling her eyes. "You know that." But Marissa wasn't clumsy. She was precise, deliberate. And those marks didn't look like the kind of thing you got from bumping into a door. Something was happening. Something she didn't want me to know about. One night, after she'd fallen asleep, I picked up her phone. I knew it was wrong. I'm a therapist, for God's sake. I tell my patients to value trust and boundaries. But I couldn't help myself. It was locked, of course. But as I stared at the screen, I realized I didn't even know her passcode. We were married. We shared a house, a bank account, a life. And I didn't know her passcode. That realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Marissa stirred in her sleep, and I quickly put the phone back on the nightstand, my heart pounding. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, wondering how the hell we'd gotten here. And for the first time, I started to think that maybe I didn't know my wife at all. I didn't know much about Dr. Julian Everett at first. He was the hospital's golden boy, a gynecologist with a stellar reputation and a jawline sharp enough to cut glass. He was a guy who always had a perfect joke at the ready during meetings, who sent flowers to the nurses on their birthdays, and who somehow managed to make delivering babies sound like a spiritual experience. The women at the hospital adored him. Every time I walked into the staff lounge, I'd hear someone gushing about how dreamy or charming he was. Even Marissa had mentioned him once or twice, casually dropping his name into conversations. Julian says they're opening up a new clinic downtown, she'd say, or Julian thinks the hospital board is dragging their feet on the funding request. Back then, I didn't think anything of it. Julian was just a colleague, another cog in the hospital machine. But once I started piecing things together, his name took on a whole new meaning. It started with a rumor. I overheard two nurses talking in the cafeteria one afternoon, their voices hushed as they leaned over their trays. "Did you see him yesterday?" One of them whispered. "He was in such a bad mood. I swear, he practically bit my head off when I asked about a patient's chart." "Yeah, he's been like that a lot lately," the other said. "I heard he got into it with Dr. Carter in the hallway the other day." She looked pissed. That got my attention. Marissa was usually unflappable at work. If Julian had rattled her, it had to be serious. Later that week, I saw them together for the first time. I was heading to my office when I spotted them in the parking garage. They were standing close, too close, and Marissa's face was tight with anger. Julian was gesturing with his hands, his voice low and intense. I ducked behind a car, my heart pounding. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but the tension between them was palpable. Marissa turned to leave, but Julian grabbed her arm. She yanked it away, her expression furious, and stormed off toward the hospital entrance. Julian stood there for a moment, running a hand through his perfectly coiffed hair before getting into his car. I told myself it was nothing, a work disagreement, maybe. Doctors have egos. It's not unusual for tempers to flare. But something about the way Julian grabbed her arm stuck with me. It wasn't just frustration, it was control. The next time I saw them together, it was in the hospital cafeteria. This time, their interaction was the opposite of tense. They were sitting at a table, laughing like old friends. Marissa had her hand on his arm, her head tilted in that way she always did when she wanted someone to feel special. Julian was eating it up, his smile smug and self-assured. My stomach turned. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to paranoia. But the more I paid attention, the more I noticed how often their paths seemed to cross. They'd pass each other in the hallway and exchange glances that lasted a little too long. I'd see Marissa checking her phone and smiling, only to put it away the second I walked into the room. And then there were the bruises. It didn't take a genius to connect the dots. Julian was the kind of guy who oozed confidence, but there was an edge to him, a sharpness beneath the charm. He was used to getting what he wanted, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't take no for an answer. I started digging. It wasn't hard to find people willing to talk about Julian. He was popular, sure, but not everyone was a fan. One nurse told me he had a reputation for being intense. Another mentioned that he'd been accused of harassment a few years back, but the complaint had mysteriously disappeared. The more I learned, the more my suspicions grew. One night, after Marissa had gone to bed, I stayed up scrolling through social media, searching for any mention of Julian. His account was pristine, pictures of him hiking, volunteering at free clinics, and posing with his dog. But the comments told a different story. "You're such an inspiration, Dr. Everett. My sister still talks about how amazing you were during her delivery." And then, buried in the replies, "Too bad you're not as nice as you seem." Huh? I clicked on the comment, but the account was private. Whoever had written it wasn't willing to share more. I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. Julian wasn't just a gynecologist with a winning smile. He was something darker, something dangerous. And Marissa? She was right in the middle of it. I didn't know what their relationship was yet, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't sit back and ignore it any longer. By now, I had accepted two uncomfortable truths. Marissa wasn't who I thought she was, and Julian Everett wasn't just a co-worker. He was something far worse. But as much as I hated the suspicions crawling through my brain, I didn't have concrete proof. I needed more. That's when fate handed me a gift in the form of Claire. Claire was one of my therapy patients, a young nurse who had been working at the hospital for a few years. She was kind, hardworking, and perpetually exhausted. When she first came to me, it was for anxiety, pretty standard stuff for anyone in healthcare. Over time, we'd built a good rapport, and I thought I knew most of her story. But one day, out of nowhere, she dropped a bomb. "I need to talk to you about something," she said, her voice hesitant. I set my pen down. Of course. What's on your mind? She fidgeted with the hem of her scrubs, avoiding my gaze. It's complicated, and I'm not even sure if I should be telling you this. Take your time, I said gently. You can tell me as much or as little as you want. She hesitated, then blurted out, it's about Dr. Carter. And Dr. Everett. My stomach flipped. Go on, I said, keeping my tone neutral. Claire took a deep breath. I saw something a few weeks ago, in the supply closet near the ore. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop or anything, but the door was open a crack, and well, they didn't notice me. What did you see? She looked at me with wide, guilt-ridden eyes. They were arguing. I mean, it started as an argument. But then Dr. Everett grabbed her by the arm and pushed her against the wall. It wasn't violent exactly, but it wasn't gentle either. And the way he was talking to her, it just didn't seem professional, you know? My hands tightened around the notebook in my lap. Did you hear what they were saying? Bits and pieces, she admitted. He was telling her she couldn't just walk away from him, that she needed to stop pretending like she didn't care. And she said something about how he was becoming a liability. It was tense, but then she paused, her face flushing with embarrassment. Then what? I prompted. They kissed, she whispered, as if saying it out loud would make it worse. The air left my lungs in a rush. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut, but I kept my expression calm. You're sure about what you saw? She nodded. I know it's none of my business, but it didn't feel right, and it's been bothering me ever since. I mean, Dr. Carter is married, and Dr. Everett, he's not exactly the kind of guy you want to get involved with. He has a reputation. What kind of reputation? Claire hesitated, as if weighing whether to say more. He's controlling. I've heard stories from some of the other nurses. Nothing concrete, but enough to make me keep my distance. I sat there, trying to process what she'd just told me. It wasn't the smoking gun I needed, but it was damn close. Why are you telling me this, Claire? I asked carefully. She shrugged, looking down at her hands. I don't know. I guess I just thought you should know. You're a good guy, Dr. Carter. You've always been kind to me, and, well, you deserve to know the truth. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to thank her, but another part of me wanted to scream. Marissa and Julian were having an affair. There was no denying it now. And the worst part? They weren't even trying that hard to hide it. After Claire left, I sat in my office for a long time, staring at the wall. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they painted was uglier than I could have imagined. Marissa wasn't just unfaithful. She was reckless. And Julian wasn't just her lover. He was dangerous. That night, I confronted Marissa. Well, sort of, you've been spending a lot of time with Julian Everett lately, I said casually over dinner. She didn't even flinch. Julian? Oh, come on, Noah. Don't tell me you're jealous. I forced a laugh, trying to match her easy demeanor. I'm not jealous. I'm just curious. You two seem close. She shrugged, spearing a piece of asparagus with her fork. We work together. Of course we're close. Honestly, I think you'd like him if you got to know him. I almost choked on my drink. Yeah, I'll get right on that, I muttered. She flashed me a smile, completely unbothered. You're cute when you're suspicious. You know that? I wanted to scream, but I kept my mouth shut. If Marissa was going to play games, fine. Two could play. By the time I started digging into Marissa and Julian's little arrangement, something in me had shifted. I wasn't the same naive husband who believed my wife could do no wrong. I'd stopped asking myself whether my suspicions were fair and started asking how long it had been going on and how the hell I'd missed it. But Marissa? Oh, she didn't miss a beat. If anything, she seemed to thrive on the tension. One morning over coffee, she hit me with a line so casual it almost made me spit out my drink. You've been really moody lately, Noah, she said, her tone dripping with faux concern. Is everything okay at work? Or is it something else? I looked up from my mug, trying to keep my face neutral. Fine. Why do you ask? She tilted her head, giving me that practiced, disarming smile. I don't know. You just seem off. Distant. Like you're distracted by something. It's not one of your patients, is it? Oh, the irony. No, I said, forcing a smile. Everything's fine. But Marissa wasn't one to let things go. Over the next few days, she ramped up her little mind games, dropping subtle comments and planting seeds of doubt like she was tending a garden of manipulation. "You've been spending a lot of time in your office," she said one evening as we sat in front of the TV. "Are you sure you're not overworking yourself? You barely eat dinner with me anymore," she pouted another night, conveniently forgetting that she was the one who was either working late or mysteriously unavailable half the time. It was classic gaslighting, turning the focus onto me, making me question my own behavior, my own sanity. But the real kicker came when she brought up the pregnancy. It was a Saturday morning, and I was sitting at the kitchen table, going through some patient notes. Marissa walked in, looking radiant as ever in her yoga pants and oversized sweater. "We need to talk," she said, her tone serious. I looked up instantly on edge. "About what?" She sat down across from me, her hands folded neatly on the table. "I've been feeling different lately. Tired, nauseous." I wasn't sure at first, but she paused, her eyes glistening with what I assumed was manufactured emotion. My stomach dropped. "But what?" "I think I might be pregnant," she said softly. If I hadn't been sitting, I probably would have fallen over. "Pregnant? With my child? That's amazing," I said, though my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. She reached across the table, taking my hand in hers. "I know things have been a little tense between us lately, but this changes everything, doesn't it?" I stared at her, my mind racing. On the surface, her timing couldn't have been more perfect. What better way to lock me in, to keep me from digging too deep into her secrets? But beneath the surface, something didn't add up. "Have you taken a test?" I asked carefully. She hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before shaking her head. "Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first. I thought we could do it together." "Of course," I said, forcing a smile. But inside, I was screaming. That night, I found myself standing in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at my reflection like it held the answers. Was she really pregnant? Or was this just another one of her games, a desperate attempt to throw me off her scent? The next morning, I casually suggested we pick up a test while running errands. Marissa agreed without hesitation, her smile as bright as ever. But when we got home, she suddenly had an excuse not to take it. "I'm too stressed right now," she said, brushing me off with a laugh. "You know how that can affect the results. Let's wait a few days, okay?" "Sure," I said, pretending to buy her excuse. But by then, I knew the truth. She wasn't pregnant. She was playing me. And the worst part? She was good at it. So good that, for a split second, I almost let myself believe her. But then I remembered Claire's words, the way Marissa and Julian had argued, the bruises on her arms, the way she'd kissed him in the supply closet like I didn't exist. No, I wasn't falling for it. That night, while Marissa slept, I pulled out my laptop and started digging deeper. I went through her social media, her emails, her credit card statements, anything I could get my hands on. And slowly, piece by piece, the web of lies began to unravel. There were charges for expensive dinners at restaurants I'd never been to, hotel reservations under her name. And the kicker? A series of text messages to a number I didn't recognize, messages that were just vague enough to set my blood boiling. "I can't tonight. He'll be home. Stop texting me at work. This is getting too risky." The messages didn't include Julian's name, but I didn't need a signature to know who they were from. As I sat there, staring at the screen, one thing became painfully clear. Marissa wasn't just a liar. She was a master manipulator, weaving a web of deceit so intricate it was a wonder she could keep track of it all. By this point, I'd accepted that Marissa's betrayal ran deeper than I'd ever imagined. The pregnancy ploy was the final straw, but the hotel receipts and cryptic text messages were the nails in the coffin. What I didn't know yet was how far Julian Everett's influence extended, or how dangerous he truly was. I was about to find out. One morning, I decided to take an earlier shift at the hospital, partly to avoid seeing Marissa over breakfast and partly because I needed some time to think. As I walked through the main hallway, I saw Julian standing by the coffee cart, talking to a group of nurses. He was in his element, laughing, flashing that perfect smile, tossing out compliments like candy. But as I passed by, his eyes flicked toward me. Just for a moment. It wasn't the look of a man caught off guard. No, it was calculated, deliberate. A flicker of amusement crossed his face, like he knew something I didn't. That was when I realized he wasn't just a participant in Marissa's betrayal. He was pulling the strings. Later that day, I sat in the staff lounge, pretending to scroll through my phone while keeping an eye on Julian. He was sitting at a corner table, talking to one of the board members, his tone low and confident. Every now and then, the board member would nod, clearly eating up whatever Julian was selling. When their conversation ended, I waited a few minutes before following Julian out into the hallway. "Dr. Everett," I called out. He turned, his expression perfectly composed. "No," he said smoothly. "What can I do for you?" I stepped closer, keeping my tone casual. "I wanted to talk to you about Marissa." His smile didn't falter, but I saw the faintest flicker of something behind his eyes. Annoyance, maybe, or amusement. "Marissa? What about her?" he asked, as if her name was just another item on his to-do list. "I've noticed you two seem close," I said, keeping my voice steady. Julian tilted his head, his smile widening. "We're colleagues. Of course, we're close. Is that a problem?" "It depends," I said, meeting his gaze. "Is there something I should know?" He chuckled, the sound dripping with condescension. "No offense, Noah, but I think you're reading too much into things. Marissa and I work together. That's all. If you're feeling insecure, maybe you should take that up with her." It was a masterful deflection, but I wasn't buying it. "I'll keep that in mind," I said, my tone cold. As I walked away, I could feel his eyes on my back, like he was sizing me up. I wasn't sure if he saw me as a threat or just an inconvenience, but either way, I knew one thing. Julian Everett wasn't just going to roll over and admit what he'd done. That night, as I sat in my office, I started digging into Julian's background. He was polished, sure, but no one gets to his level of arrogance without leaving a trail of skeletons somewhere. It didn't take long to find the first crack. A lawsuit buried in the archives of a local court database. A nurse had accused Julian of harassment a few years ago, claiming he'd made inappropriate advances and threatened her when she tried to speak out. The case had been settled out of court, the details sealed, but the accusations were damning. Then there was the clinic he'd worked at before joining our hospital. According to a few old news articles, Julian had left under controversial circumstances. The clinic's director had declined to comment, but anonymous sources claimed there had been issues with his behavior toward female staff members. This wasn't just a man with a dark side. This was a man who thrived on power, control, and intimidation. The next morning, I decided to test the waters. I cornered one of the nurses in the break room, someone I knew had worked with Julian for years. "Hey, can I ask you something?" I said, keeping my tone light. "Sure," she said, sipping her coffee. "What's the deal with Dr. Everett? I've been hearing some interesting things." Her eyes darted around the room, checking to make sure no one was listening. Then she leaned in closer. "Off the record," she whispered. I nodded. "He's bad news," she said bluntly. "He's charming, sure, but if you cross him, he'll make your life hell. And if you're a woman, forget it. He knows how to make you feel like you're the one in the wrong. A lot of people won't say anything because they're scared of him." "Scared of what?" I asked, my chest tightening. She hesitated, then said, "He's got dirt on people. Emails, texts, photos, stuff he can use against you if you try to stand up to him. That's how he gets away with everything." I felt my stomach churn. If Julian had leverage over Marissa, it explained a lot. The bruises, the tension, the way she seemed both drawn to him and terrified of him. But it also meant that confronting him wasn't just risky, it was dangerous. For the first time, I realized that this wasn't just about infidelity. This was about power, control, and the lengths people would go to protect their secrets. And if Julian thought he could use his leverage to keep Marissa under his thumb, he was about to learn that I wasn't afraid to fight dirty. By now, the puzzle pieces were coming together, but the picture they painted was darker than I'd anticipated. Marissa wasn't just cheating. She was trapped in some twisted game with Julian. And Julian wasn't just her lover. He was a predator who thrived on manipulation and control. It was time to confront her. I waited until a Saturday morning, figuring she'd be less likely to storm out or make excuses when there was no work emergency to run to. She was sitting in the living room, sipping her coffee and scrolling through her phone like it was any other day. "Marissa," I said, stepping into the room. She looked up, her expression carefully neutral. "What's up? We need to talk." Her eyes flickered, just for a second, before she set her mug down. Sure. What about? I sat across from her, taking a deep breath to steady myself. About Julian. About what's really going on between you two. She blinked, her face a mask of feigned confusion. What are you talking about? Don't do that, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Don't pretend like you don't know what I mean. I know about the hotel rooms, the texts, the arguments in the hallway. I know about the bruises, Marissa. Her mouth opened, then closed again. For the first time in a long time, she seemed caught off guard. You've been spying on me? She finally said, her tone laced with indignation. Don't turn this around on me, I snapped. I wouldn't have to if you weren't lying to my face every single day. She stood up, crossing her arms. You're being paranoid. Julian and I are colleagues, friends. That's it. Friends don't book hotel rooms together, I shot back. Friends don't grab each other in supply closets or leave bruises on each other's arms. Her jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought she was going to deny it again. But then she surprised me. Fine, she said, her voice cold. You want the truth? Yes, I've been seeing Julian. Are you happy now? The admission hit me like a punch to the chest, even though I'd already known. Hearing her say it out loud made it real in a way it hadn't been before. How long? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Does it matter? She said, shrugging. It's not like you've been the perfect husband, Noah. That made me snap. Are you kidding me? I've been over backwards for you, Marissa. I've supported you, defended you, loved you. And this is how you repay me. She rolled her eyes, like my anger was an inconvenience. Don't act like you're some saint. You've been so busy playing therapist to everyone else that you barely even notice me anymore. That's bullsh**, and you know it, I shot back. This isn't about me. This is about you and Julian and whatever sick, twisted thing you've got going on with him. She flinched at that, and for a moment, I thought I saw something like fear in her eyes. But it was gone just as quickly, replaced by her usual icy composure. You don't understand, she said quietly. Then help me understand, I said, leaning forward. Why him? Why Julian? What is it about him that made you throw away everything we built together? She hesitated, then said, because he sees me. The real me. Not the version of me you want to believe in. Her words stung, but they also confirmed what I'd suspected all along. Marissa wasn't just unfaithful. She was broken in ways I hadn't fully grasped. And the bruises? I pressed. Her face darkened. That's none of your business. It is my business, I said. You're my wife, Marissa. Or at least you were. If he's hurting you, I can handle Julian, she said sharply, cutting me off. Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. She wasn't denying that Julian was abusive. She was just refusing to admit she needed help. I stared at her, trying to make sense of the person sitting across from me. This wasn't the Marissa I'd fallen in love with, the woman who could light up a room with her smile. This was someone else entirely, someone cold, calculating, and willing to burn everything down if it meant keeping control. You're lying to yourself if you think you can handle him, I said finally. She laughed bitterly. And what do you suggest, Noah? That I come clean? That I throw myself at your feet and beg for forgiveness? You'd love that, wouldn't you? I don't want your apology, I said, my voice hard. I want the truth. All of it. Her expression shifted, her mask slipping for just a moment. You can't handle the truth, she said quietly. Try me, I said. She opened her mouth, but before she could say anything, her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen, and her face went pale. It's him, isn't it? I said. She didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed her phone and walked out of the room, leaving me sitting there with more questions than answers. After Marissa walked out of the room that morning, I sat there stewing in a mix of anger and determination. Her cryptic statements about Julian and the way she seemed almost afraid of him were enough to convince me that this was about more than just infidelity. It wasn't just about us anymore. It was about control, power, and whatever leverage Julian had over her. I decided to go straight to the source. That evening, after my shift, I made my way to Julian's office. The hospital halls were quiet, most of the staff having already gone home. His door was open, and I could see him sitting at his desk, typing away on his laptop. Julian, I said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. He looked up, surprised but not rattled. His ever-present smirk tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Noah, to what do I owe the pleasure?" I shut the door behind me, leaning against it. "We need to talk." "Do we?" he said, leaning back in his chair. "If this is about Marissa, I think you're barking up the wrong tree. Whatever's going on between you two is none of my business." "Cut the crap," I said, my voice low but firm. "I know about the affair. I know about the hotel rooms, the texts, all of it. I know you've been using her." His smile didn't falter, but his eyes darkened slightly. "Using her? That's an interesting choice of words." "She's my wife, Julian," I said, stepping closer. "And I'm not going to let you drag her down with whatever sick game you're playing." He stood up, closing the distance between us. For a moment, I thought he might try to intimidate me, but instead, he just chuckled. "Noah, you're a therapist, right?" he said, his tone mocking. "You should know better than to project your insecurities onto other people." "This isn't about me," I said through gritted teeth. "It's about you. You're a predator, Julian. You manipulate people, you use them, and then you toss them aside when you're done. But this time, you've gone too far." Julian's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "You think you know what's going on? You think you've got it all figured out?" "I know enough," I said. "I know you've been blackmailing her. I know about the bruises. And I know about the harassment complaint that disappeared a few years ago. You're not as untouchable as you think you are." For the first time, I saw a flicker of something like doubt in his eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "Careful, Noah," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're treading on thin ice." "No, you're the one who should be careful," I shot back. "Because if you think you can keep getting away with this, you're wrong. I'm going to expose you, Julian. And when I do, you'll lose everything. Your job, your reputation, your career." He laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "You think you can take me down? Go ahead, try. But you might want to think about what it'll cost you." "What's that supposed to mean?" I asked, my fists clenching in my sides. "It means I've got insurance," he said, his smirk returning. "You're not the only one who's been paying attention, Noah. I've got dirt on Marissa on the hospital board on half the staff in this building. You think they'll back you up when I start airing their dirty laundry?" I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" he said, raising an eyebrow. "Go ahead, test me. See how far you get before you realize you've bitten off more than you can chew." I stared at him, my mind racing. If what he was saying was true, then this wasn't just about Marissa's affair. It was about an entire network of lies and corruption that Julian had built around himself. But I couldn't back down now. "You're a coward," I said, my voice steady. "You hide behind your charm and your threats because you're too weak to face the consequences of your actions. But sooner or later, people like you always slip up. And when you do, I'll be there to make sure you fall." Julian's smirk faded, replaced by a glare that sent a chill down my spine. "You got guts, Noah. I'll give you that. But don't mistake guts for intelligence. Walk away while you still can." I didn't respond. I just turned and walked out of his office, my heart pounding in my chest. As I stepped into the hallway, I realized that I'd just declared war on a man who thrived on destroying people. But I wasn't going to let him win, because now it wasn't just about Marissa or our marriage. It was about bringing Julian down before he could hurt anyone else. By the time I got home that night, I was running on adrenaline. The confrontation with Julian had only solidified my resolve. He was dangerous, manipulative, and arrogant enough to think he was untouchable. But I knew something he didn't. Everyone has a weakness. Marissa was sitting on the couch when I walked in, her face buried in her phone. She didn't look up as I dropped my bag by the door. "Busy?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She glanced up, her expression guarded. "What's with the tone?" "We need to talk," I said, walking into the living room. She sighed, setting her phone down. "We already talked, Noah. I told you the truth. What more do you want from me?" "I want to know why you're protecting him," I said, crossing my arms. Her face hardened. "I'm not protecting anyone. Don't lie to me," I snapped. "I confronted Julian today. He all but admitted he's got leverage over you, and probably half the hospital. What does he have on you, Marissa? What's he holding over your head?" Her eyes widened. and for a moment, I thought I saw fear flash across her face. But she recovered quickly, her expression shifting to one of annoyance. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, her voice low. "Why not?" I demanded. "What are you so afraid of?" She stood up, crossing her arms defensively. "You don't understand, Noah. Julian isn't someone you can just confront. He has connections, power. If you go after him, he'll ruin you." "Let him try," I said. "I'm not the one sneaking around, lying and booking hotel rooms. I've got nothing to hide. Can you say the same?" Her face turned red, a mix of anger and shame. "You don't get it," she said through clenched teeth. "Then help me get it," I shouted. "Tell me what's going on, Marissa. Tell me why you're letting this guy control your life." For a moment, she just stared at me, her chest rising and falling as if she was struggling to keep herself together. And then, finally, she broke. "Fine," she said, her voice trembling. "You want the truth? Julian has photos, videos, stuff he could use to destroy me if he wanted to. And it's not just me, Noah. It's other people, too. Nurses, doctors, even patients. He's been doing this for years, getting close to people, digging up dirt on them, and keeping it as leverage. That's how he stays in control." Her words hit me like a freight train. I had suspected Julian was dirty, but this was worse than I'd imagined. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice softer now. "Because I thought I could handle it," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. "I thought I could outsmart him, keep him at bay. But he's always one step ahead. Every time I try to pull away, he finds a way to reel me back in." I sat down, running a hand through my hair. "Marissa, why didn't you just come to me? We could have dealt with this together." She laughed bitterly. "Dealt with it how, Noah? You think the hospital board would believe me over him? You think they'd risk a scandal? Julian is untouchable." "Not if we expose him," I said firmly. She shook her head. "It's not that simple. If he goes down, he'll take me, and a lot of other people with him. He's got files, Noah. Emails, texts, photos. He's been collecting evidence on everyone, just in case." For the first time, I saw the cracks in her armor. She wasn't the confident, untouchable woman I'd married. She was scared, vulnerable, and trapped. But I wasn't about to let Julian win. "I don't care what he has," I said. "We're going to take him down. Together." "How?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We find his leverage," I said. "The files, the photos, whatever he's been using to control people. And then we destroy it." She stared at me, her eyes filled with doubt. "You really think it's that easy?" "No," I admitted. "But it's a hell of a lot better than sitting here and letting him keep us under his thumb." Marissa was quiet for a long time, and then, finally, she nodded. "Okay," she said. "But if we're doing this, we have to be careful. Julian doesn't play fair." "Neither do I," said. That night, as we sat together, sketching out a plan to take Julian down, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger, fear, and betrayal. Yes, but also hope. For the first time in months, Marissa wasn't hiding behind her lies. She was raw, honest, and vulnerable. And though I didn't know if we could fix what had been broken between us, I knew one thing for sure. We were in this together. The plan to take Julian down wasn't simple. It couldn't be. The man had built a fortress of deceit, one brick of blackmail at a time, and dismantling it meant being smart, methodical, and unrelenting. It also meant taking risks, the kind that made my stomach churn every time I thought about them. But if we didn't do this, he'd keep hurting people. He'd keep winning. Marissa and I spent days gathering everything we had on him. She shared everything she knew. The hotel receipts, the texts, the bruises he left as subtle warnings. I tapped into my skills as a therapist, carefully talking to people who might have been victims of Julian's schemes. Claire, the nurse who had confided in me weeks ago, turned out to be a pivotal ally. She admitted that she wasn't the only one who had seen Julian's darker side. "He preys on people he thinks he can control," Claire told me one afternoon. "I've heard stories, stuff that would make your skin crawl. But no one wants to come forward because they're scared of him." "Do you think they'd talk if they knew he was about to go down?" I asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "Maybe, but they need to know it's safe." That was all the encouragement I needed. Marissa had mentioned that Julian kept files, actual, physical files, in a locked cabinet in his office. She'd seen them once when she'd been called in to discuss a patient case. If those files existed, they could be the key to exposing him. That's how I found myself crouched outside Julian's office late one night, my heart pounding like a drum. Marissa was standing watch in the hallway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "This is insane," she whispered as I picked the lock on his door. "Maybe," I whispered back, "but it's the only way." The lock clicked open, and I slipped inside, closing the door behind me. Julian's office was as pristine and polished as he was. Everything in its place, not a speck of dust in sight. But I wasn't here to admire his interior decorating skills. I went straight for the cabinet Marissa had described, tugging on the handle. Locked. Of course. I pulled out the small toolkit I'd borrowed from maintenance earlier that day and got to work. It wasn't easy. Julian had clearly invested in good security. But after what felt like an eternity, the lock gave way. Inside, I found exactly what I'd been hoping for: files. Dozens of them, each labeled with a name. I pulled one out at random and flipped it open. Inside were printed emails, text message screenshots, and photos. Evidence Julian had collected to blackmail someone. My stomach churned as I realized just how deep his manipulation ran. I snapped photos of everything with my phone, knowing we couldn't risk taking the files themselves. If Julian noticed they were missing, he'd know someone was onto him. By the time I was done, my hands were shaking. I shoved the files back into the cabinet, locked it, and slipped out of the office. "Did you get it?" Marissa whispered as we hurried down the hallway. "Oh, I got it," I said, holding up my phone. The next step was getting the evidence into the right hands. I reached out to a journalist I knew, someone who specialized in exposing corruption. I didn't give her all the details right away, just enough to pique her interest. When I showed her the photos of the files, her eyes widened. "This is huge," she said. "It's also dangerous," I warned her. "Julian has a lot of influence. If you're going to run with this, you need to be prepared for backlash." She nodded, her expression grim. "Don't worry. I've dealt with men like him before." Over the next week, the journalist worked tirelessly, digging into Julian's past, corroborating the evidence we'd given her with other sources. She found more victims, women and men who had been too afraid to come forward until now. The story broke on a Thursday morning. By noon, the hospital was in chaos. The article detailed years of manipulation, blackmail, and harassment, all tied back to Julian Everett. It included testimonials from victims, copies of the evidence we'd uncovered, and even an expose on how the hospital board had turned a blind eye to his behavior. Marissa and I watched the fallout unfold from my office, the tension between us palpable. "He's not going to take this lying down," she said quietly. "I know," I said, "but he can't escape this. Not this time." Julian was fired that same day, escorted out of the building by security as staff members whispered and stared. He didn't go quietly. Of course he didn't. "This isn't over," he shouted as he was led past the nurse's station. His eyes locked on mine, full of fury. "You'll regret this, no?" I didn't respond. I didn't need to. In the weeks that followed, the hospital launched an internal investigation. Several board members resigned in disgrace, and new policies were put in place to prevent someone like Julian from ever gaining that kind of power again. As for Marissa and me, things were complicated. The trust between us had been shattered, and rebuilding it wasn't going to be easy. But for the first time in months, I felt like we were on the same side. "I don't know if we can fix this," she admitted one night as we sat on the couch. "Neither do I said honestly. "But we can try." She nodded, her eyes heavy with regret. "Thank you, Noah, for everything." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. And Julian Everett? Last I heard, he'd left the city, his reputation in tatters. Whatever leverage he thought he had was gone, his victims finally free from his grip. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was enough. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again.